All right, it's time for an article that's not only totally false, but it's also on the bigoted side, let's just put it that way, by Nathan Wurtenberg, actually, with the Washington Post. And the title of it, I'll read out. Gun rights are about keeping white men on top, it says. Yeah, because clearly, if you're female or you're non-white and you go to the gun store, they'll just refuse you service because that's happened so many times. No, actually not. And of course, this article is making the claim, oh, there's more crime, there's more mass shootings now. There are not more mass shootings now than in the past. There's certainly not more gun crime than in the past. There's far less violent crime overall. There's far less gun crime overall. In the Obama era, what you get is a change in the definition used for mass shooting to indicate shootings with, I believe it's 3 or more people as opposed to 4 or more. In the past, they actually change the threshold for what a mass shooting involves in order to buff up the number. That was probably done because the actual number of mass shootings was so astronomically low that it was almost not worth talking about. What you end up getting then are a handful of incidents where there are many, many casualties, where you have maybe 10 people, 20 people killed or injured. Now you have a mass shooting event that, you wouldn't deny that the term was applicable. And those get major coverage. They get spoken of. They get spoken of specifically because in many parts of the country, where you are indeed incredibly safe, you're as safe as if you were in the middle of rural Switzerland, trust me. You probably have never had a local shooting in the last 10, 20 years. You may remember sometime, 15 years back, some hunter thought it was a deer and it was actually his drunken grandpa and shot him in the leg. You probably have a situation like that. Unless you are in one of a few dozen very blighted parts of this country, you're actually pretty damn safe. Did you know that? Did you know that the majority of the gun crime that happens in the United States happens in a few blighted metro districts in a few cities? No, most people don't know that. They think that it's like evenly spread across the U.S. They talk about gun crime and it's freakish. They're 100 miles away from the nearest spot where there's been a gun crime in the last year, and they think that it's like a major epidemic. They don't know anything about the FBI crime stats, and they apparently don't know anything about the history of gun rights and gun control. No, gun rights started off with the founding of this country, specifically as a measure against tyranny, not just domestic, that's usually the one that's alluded to, but also against potentially a foreign adversary. The concept was with a militarized, well-armed population, you didn't need to rely upon a centralized standing army that could be misused by a domestic government too. If you did have such a military and it was misused, if there was tyranny, the people then could resist it. It's explicit. The concept that you needed a gun, you needed it to go hunting because they wanted to enshrine the right of people to have their musket and go hunting is crazy. No. People back then, communities or individuals, own their own stockpiles. It would have been odd for a person not to own some sort of topical firearm back during that period. Whether they were urban or suburban wouldn't have made any difference. Somebody in a suburban area, they probably had at least a dagger or a pistol, the short black powder weapon, a flintlock, get their blunderbuss or something. And if you were more rural, you probably owned an actual musket. At the time, this was cutting-edge military technology, and they could only be manufactured in a few urban centers anyway, because only a few urban centers had the kind of industrial infrastructure necessary to requisition the supplies to make enough muskets and musket balls and to make the black powder, which of course was done by private civilians, not government contractors, not the U.S. military, for there was none at the time. Private individuals made these things. They milled their own materials. No, gun control stems from white supremacy. If you know anything about the history of gun control, really U.S. gun control, as we call it today, we give it this family-friendly label. It starts with the Cruikshank decision, 1870s, in the era just after the Civil War. What happened? For the first time, many, many black individuals, hundreds of thousands of black people within the country who had been slaves, all of a sudden they were citizens. Oh no, said the Southern Democrats, for that's exactly what 100% of the Ku Klux Klan members were. Oh shit, now black people are citizens, that means they can own weapons. Oh, quick, we'll use the courts. What the decision that was made, in typical Jim Crow fashion, was that the Second Amendment did not defend the individual right to bear arms. It didn't have anything to do with private citizens. That is, you could restrict, the government could restrict them at a whim, and it involved the states could do that. And this decision stood at the time. Unfortunately, this set the stage for 100 years of shitty gun control legislation, up to and including, of course, the assault weapon ban of the Clinton era, which did nothing to stop violent crime. Actually, it was around the time it was rescinded that it starts to drop off a cliff. Now, that coincides with the internet and with some other good stuff, free speech being promulgated really helps. The McDonald versus Chicago decision of I believe it was 2008, that overrules Cruikshank, is really the death knell of gun control. What we ended up with is a century of gun control, a little more than a century, based on a bunch of Southern Democrats wanting to disarm black people. That's the history of gun control in the United States. It literally begins with a decision that was racially based. It was pure Jim Crow. But you're never going to hear about this in your school books. You're never going to hear about this from people on the left. They don't want to talk about the Cruikshank decision. They don't want to talk about McDonald versus Chicago. They don't want to talk about the fact that it is explicit and has been held explicitly by court after court in the modern period. Yeah, the Second Amendment, according to this language, specifically is inclined towards the general public. By the way, all of these people on the left, I'm sure the author here would be one of them. He's, I guess, pro-disarmament or something. This is why it's totally wrong. These bits of gun control legislation being passed in Florida and Oregon will be shot down because it will be explicitly overruled on the basis that if you've hit the age of majority, which is 18, yeah, you can exercise your Second Amendment rights. No restrictions beyond what the equal protection under the law. You can't have a class of people that, because they're just under 21, they can't effectively defend themselves, even though they're in a gray area and they can still buy, like, I think in Florida, they'll be able to buy like a handgun, but they can't buy an assault rifle, so-called. Well, that's unconstitutional. It's going to be founded. The NRA is sitting back chuckling right now. I saw Being Liberal is posting, oh, despite the NRA bullies, Florida bravely passed gun control. Okay, you're giving credit to a Republican governor, someone, by the way, that on evangelical issues, oh man, you'd think that he was totally out there. He's fucking crazy, and he is. He's also a rhino when it comes to guns and to taxes. Rick Scott's a moron. He shouldn't be in office. They should have kicked him out long ago. He's one of the most corrupt politicians you can possibly imagine. In the most corrupt state, by the way, in the United States. After maybe D.C., which is it's a city-state of sorts. It's one of those weird, yeah, you live there, you don't exactly get representation, which I'm not sure how the founders ultimately would think about the system today, considering the number of people living in the region. Maybe it's for the better, though, because DC's, it'd be representing politicians and lawyers and shit, so who gives a fuck? No, gun control starts in the mid-1800s with Jim Crow. It starts with literally racism against black people. Oh, shit, if these black people have firearms, we won't be able to, bully them around at the ballot box, was essentially what the Southern Democrats were thinking. We've got to militarize the court here and make sure they can't have firearms. That's what it was. You didn't have this problem, by the way, in the northern states. In the northern state, they didn't give a fuck if you were black. Yeah, here's a revolver. In the southern states, though, it gave the states discretion. It was a states' rights issue, too, in part. It gave them the discretion to say, okay, yeah, the gun dealers, they can choose who they sell a gun to. They can refuse service to whoever they want. Sort of like in the hippie era, you get no shirt, no shoes, no service. Why do you think that was implemented in the first place? It was to create a subpar class of people that could be mistreated, basically, for political reasons. But it was done in part as, businesses should be able to choose who they do business with. It's basically what it is. And it's been maintained to this day. Eventually, maybe that'll be ruled unlawful, too. I would think maybe he can't afford shoes. Maybe you should give him a pair of shoes, be like Jesus. Give him some sandals. Not necessarily great for this climate down south. I suppose that could work. But no, it was Cruikshank. It was the Cruikshank decision. Now, that was Southern Democrat mode. It was literal Jim Crow mode. That's what kicks off gun control. There was no gun control in the United States as you are envisioning it for its first 100 years of existence. It was taken for granted. Why wouldn't a slave can't own a firearm? A citizen, someone who has legal rights under the Constitution, of course, I should be able to own whatever I want. Fucking, I've got a cannon, and here's my 3 muskets, and then I've got my revolver, and I'm making my own, black powder and stuff. That's what they did. It was common. It wasn't even particularly uncommon for people they made their own bullets. They made their own musket balls and shit. Then that comes along. Really, the era of sort of Gilded Age plutocratic abuse, it really starts with the Southern mentality. When it comes to these things, it really starts with the Jim Crow concept of splitting people apart on a racial basis, of course. And it ends with McDonald versus Chicago, very, very recently, 10 years ago in our history. I believe it was 2008. And there are other cases. I think Heller versus, I can't remember the full name of it, but the Heller case, I believe, was involved. I think that was 2004. There have been a number of cases recently decided, completely in favor of gun rights, completely in favor of people defending themselves, being citizens as opposed to slaves. Like, there's no better way to enslave people than to begin denigrating their ability to actually preserve themselves and their nation, make them reliant upon a centralized sort of government system. By the way, I'm sure that the author here would be one of those people who says, well, this is well-regulated militia. The government can regulate it. No. Exactly the opposite of what it means. It specifically means in a vacuum away from government, the people can regulate their own militia, which means that they have sufficient powder and arms, so to speak. That means that they have military-style weapons. That's specifically what the Second Amendment pertains to. It's going to be funny when an eventual case is lodged and successfully makes it to the Supreme Court. It's going to be very, very funny when they have no choice but to explicitly point that out, so that people go back to, like they did prior to, I believe, the 1930s, they can own like Tommy guns and stuff. They should be able to. We didn't have problems with like mass shootings at the time. I wonder why. Could it be that nobody wants to buy this expensive weapon? No one's culturally alienated enough to be psychopathic enough to want to bother to go kill a bunch of people? Because that's the mark of lunacy. Now, I think you need to look at mental health and education. You need to back off the gun right denigration bullshit. Because specifically, as a citizen, I have the right to own firearms. No other person has the right to tell me that I can't. There's no force that's going to cause me to do so unless they're willing to use guns to kill me. Well, yeah, therein lies the paradox, of course. These people who don't want the civilians to have guns would need a great number of guns in order to actually cause that to happen. And they preface it on saying we don't want killing. But they'd have to slaughter some tens of millions of people to get to their, I guess, glorious communist utopia that they really want. So remember the Cruikshank decision. And remember where that actually comes from, the mentality behind it. It's not gun rights that are white supremacy. It's gun control. Your origins lie in Jim Crow. Yeah, just so you know that. That's about all. Peace out.